The serial killer who hunted at nightclubs. The story of Stephen Port. The body lay on the cold pavement, just a few steps away from the entrance of a quiet London apartment complex. It was early morning, and the streets were empty except for one man, Stephen Port. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around in panic and calculation. He had dragged the young man's lifeless body outside in the darkness of night, arranging it carefully, almost as if he wanted it to look like the victim had simply collapsed on his own. In the stillness, Port placed an empty syringe near the body, making sure it looked like an overdose. He straightened up, his heart pounding, then quickly walked back inside his flat, shutting the door behind him. When the police arrived later that morning, they didn't suspect anything unusual. To them, it was just another tragic overdose. Another young man lost to drugs. What nobody realized yet was that this was only the beginning. Behind that door, in that ordinary-looking flat, lived a man who was about to terrorize London's nightlife. A man who hunted his prey where music was loud, drinks flowed, and nobody thought twice about meeting strangers. Stephen Port, the so-called Grindr Killer, had started his deadly game. But how did it come to this? Who was this quiet, seemingly harmless man who blended into the crowd so easily? And how did he turn the nightclubs of London into his personal hunting ground? It all began years before that body was found. Stephen Port grew up in Essex, in a fairly ordinary neighborhood. By all accounts, he was shy, awkward, and had trouble connecting with people. In school, other kids teased him for being quiet and strange. Teachers remembered him as someone who didn't quite fit in, often sitting by himself. He had no close friends, no group to call his own. As he grew older, that sense of loneliness only deepened. By his early 20s, Stephen had moved to London, where he worked as a chef in a local bus depot canteen. To his co-workers, he seemed harmless, maybe a little odd, but nothing dangerous. He lived alone in a small apartment and didn't talk much about his personal life. But behind closed doors, Stephen's world was very different. On his laptop, he spent hours browsing gay dating sites and apps, especially Grindr. He used fake photos and fake names, creating different profiles to lure men into meeting him. At first, these meetings were harmless. Dinners, chats, casual hookups. But over time, Stephen became obsessed with control. He wanted not just companionship, but dominance, total submission. And slowly, his desires turned darker. London's gay nightlife in the 2010s was vibrant. Clubs pulsed with neon lights, drinks in hand, people dancing, flirting, laughing. It was easy to meet someone, easy to disappear into the crowd. For predators like Stephen Port, this was the perfect environment. Nobody questioned why a man left with another man at 2 a.m. Nobody kept track of who came and who went. Stephen began hanging around outside these nightclubs, sometimes chatting with strangers, sometimes waiting until the perfect opportunity arose. But his real power came through the screen of his phone. On Grindr, he could be whoever he wanted. He could pretend to be charming, funny, trustworthy. And the young men who responded had no idea they were walking into a trap. One of his first victims was Anthony Walgate, a 23-year-old fashion student with big dreams. Anthony had moved to London to study, full of energy and creativity. He was known as outgoing and ambitious, someone who loved life and wanted to make something of himself. When he matched with Stephen on Grindr, he thought it was just another date. But on that fateful night in June 2014, Anthony's life was cut short. He was found outside Stephen's apartment, lifeless, with traces of a lethal drug in his system. Stephen had called 999 himself, pretending to be a passerby who had simply found a stranger collapsed near his home. His calm voice convinced the operator that he was just trying to help. The police arrived, wrote down their notes, and soon closed the case as another overdose. Nobody thought to question the quiet man who had reported it. Nobody searched his apartment. Nobody dug deeper into his background. Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. His plan had worked. But deep inside, he felt a dangerous thrill. He had gotten away with it. The high was intoxicating. And like many killers before him, Stephen Port couldn't stop at just one. The high was intoxicating. And like many killers before him, Stephen Port couldn't stop at just one. Weeks later, He was back on Grindr, back on the hunt. This time, he was even more careful. He knew how to make the deaths look natural, how to pose the bodies, how to fool the authorities. Each step he took was calculated, rehearsed. His next victim, Gabriel Kovari, was just 22 years old. Gabriel had recently moved to London from Slovakia, full of hope and excitement for a new life. He was trusting, open, and eager to make friends. When he met Stephen, he thought he had found a kind older man who was offering him a place to stay. But kindness was just the mask Stephen wore. One night, after slipping drugs into Gabriel's drink, he watched as the young man's body grew weaker until it finally gave way. Then, like a hunter with his prey, Stephen dragged the body out into the open, leaving it propped near a churchyard wall. When passers-by discovered Gabriel, they assumed it was another overdose, just another tragedy in the city. Once again, the police didn't connect the dots. Two young men, both gay, both found dead within walking distance of Stephen's apartment. But still, nobody suspected him. The sense of power inside Stephen grew stronger. He felt untouchable. Yet behind every quiet step he took, behind every carefully staged overdose, Stephen left behind pieces of himself, clues that would one day expose his lies. The truth was closing in, though he didn't know it yet. And then came the night when his cruelty would reach an even darker level. A night when he chose another victim. This time a man named Daniel Whitworth. Daniel was only 21 years old, a kind-hearted chef with dreams of building a life in London. Stephen lured him in just as he had done with the others. But this time, Stephen went further. Not only did he kill Daniel, but he also planted a fake suicide note next to his body, making it seem as though Daniel had confessed to killing Gabriel before taking his own life. It was a cruel trick, one that cast suspicion on an innocent victim, and allowed Stephen to slip away once again. The city carried on as usual. The nightclubs kept pulsing with life. The music kept playing. But in the shadows, Stephen Port kept hunting, his appetite for control growing stronger each day. And then, one early morning, just before dawn, another body was discovered. It was sprawled in the same area, cold and lifeless, with all the same signs as before. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Too many young men, too many overdoses, all in the same place. The truth was starting to surface. But before anyone could piece it together, Stephen had already chosen his next target. He was already planning his next move, already preparing for another night of hunting. And that night would change everything. The fourth body lay on the same patch of ground as the others, a quiet spot near a churchyard wall in Barking, East London. The sun had barely risen when a dog walker noticed a shape on the grass. At first, the man thought it was just someone sleeping off a rough night. But as he got closer, the truth became clear. The young man wasn't sleeping. He wasn't breathing. His skin was pale, and beside him were empty syringes and a small bottle. This victim was 25-year-old Jack Taylor, a kind, down-to-earth man who worked as a forklift driver. He wasn't flashy or loud. He loved his family, stayed close to his sisters, and was the kind of guy who made people feel safe around him. But on that night in September 2015, Jack had met Stephen Port, and like the others, he would never make it home. For the police, this was yet another tragic overdose. But for the people of Barking, whispers began to spread. Too many young men, too many deaths in the same small area. Something didn't feel right. Families were asking questions. Why weren't the police investigating deeper? How could so many lives be lost, all under such similar circumstances? Stephen Port, however, felt invisible. He believed he had fooled everyone. In his mind, he was smarter than the police, smarter than the neighbors, smarter than anyone who dared to look too closely. Each time he staged a death, he grew bolder. Each time he posed a body, he smiled at how easy it was to make it look like nothing more than drugs. But beneath that calm exterior, cracks were beginning to form. Neighbors had started to notice odd things about Stephen. He was seen dragging large bags at night, heard moving around at strange hours. Some thought he was just eccentric, but others grew uneasy. The young men who went into his flat never seemed to come back. And while he acted friendly in passing, polite, even cheerful, there was something cold about his eyes. Meanwhile, families of the victims refused to stay silent. Anthony Walgate's mother begged investigators to dig deeper into her son's death. Gabriel Kovari's friends couldn't understand why such a happy young man would suddenly overdose. Daniel Whitworth's loved ones rejected the cruel suicide note that had been planted next to his body, knowing it wasn't his handwriting, wasn't his voice. And Jack Taylor's sisters were relentless. They knew their brother. They knew he didn't do hard drugs. They fought for the truth, calling the police again and again, refusing to let Jack's death be brushed aside. Still, in those months, Stephen Port walked freely through Barking. He still worked in the canteen. He still went online, creating fake profiles, talking to men who had no idea they were speaking to Killer. The nightclub still buzzed with life, and Stephen still slipped among the crowd, unnoticed, searching. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. For bodies, for overdoses, for young gay men, and all within a few hundred yards of one man's flat. Then came the night when Stephen made his biggest mistake. It was late, and he had once again lured a man to his apartment. He had his drugs ready, his plan rehearsed, but something went wrong. Maybe the victim resisted. Maybe Stephen lost control. Maybe, for the first time, fear cracked through his calm mask. The situation spiraled, and before long, there was noise. Too much noise. A neighbor heard shouting. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. The illusion of control slipped from Stephen's grasp. In that moment, for the first time, he felt exposed, vulnerable. The walls of his carefully built lies seemed ready to collapse. He scrambled to cover his tracks, to silence the evidence, to make sure nothing could be traced back to him. But this time, he wasn't as careful. This time, he left behind traces, details the police could no longer ignore. Detectives began to piece things together. They compared notes, re-examined reports, looked again at the scene photos. The similarities screamed for attention. The drugs used, the positioning of the bodies, the repeated location. Slowly, painfully slowly, the truth began to dawn. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. This was murder. And while investigators moved quietly behind the scenes, Stephen Port went about his days, still convinced he was in control. He walked past the churchyard where bodies had been found. He cooked meals at work. He logged into Grindr, searching for his next victim. But the city was no longer blind. Families demanded justice. Journalists started digging, uncovering shocking gaps in the police investigation. The press asked why it had taken 4 deaths for anyone to connect the dots. The walls were closing in, and Stephen Port, the man who thought he could hunt forever, was about to face his reckoning. Then, one evening, as he prepared for yet another meeting with a new man he had met online, a knock came at the door, a hard, firm knock that echoed through the flat. When Stephen opened it, he wasn't greeted by a smiling stranger. Instead, uniformed officers stood before him, their eyes cold and unflinching. The hunt had turned. The predator was about to become the prey, and what the police found inside his flat would shock everyone.